Hello and welcome, Truth Proofers, for another live stream from the Truth Proof channel. And welcome to the stream, Paul.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Les. A bit of a hectic one tonight, people, because our... Oh, Christ, let me... 1 second. My fault there, guys. Yeah, our guest has not turned up. So next week's guest, Nick Kyle, might be standing in. We're just going to give Grant Cameron 5 to 10 minutes to see whether he's going to show. He did tell me in week he were coming. And regardless, if he can't, there's something unfortunate that's happened, I would have thought, because he seems pretty reliable and an absolutely great speaker. We're really looking forward to talking to Grant Cameron.
Yeah, I mean, there is a chance he could have got the times mixed up as well, because I think he could be in Canada or America.
Yeah.
So
unfortunate,
Paul. Yeah.
So basically, if not, we'll be talking to Nick Kyle, and I've got no questions prepared for Nick Kyle, but we'll be talking about, amongst other things, the skull experiments, because this guy's his finger on pulse is probably the most knowledgeable guy out there with that. So in the meantime, people in chat, we got Rebecca King, Disabled Welshman, Andy Codes, Joanne, Stargazer. I'll say I'm really slow in case we're waiting for Nick Kyle. Billy G, Patrick Daniel. Let's have a look. Henrietta Carrot. What a great name. Yeah, Deb Shaw. And let's have a look. I think Lorraine's in. Ben 22, Margaret Webster, Tony Worrell, D Moon, David Bancroft, Gordon and Julie. Good to see you. And Sober Carper. And there's bound to be more, and I'd love to just say, and let's jump into it and talk to our guest, but we don't have him at the moment.
Yeah, and Kim King, I can see in there, and so look, nicknames coming. DM Moon Sun, welcome to the show, guys. Unfortunately, if you just missed it at the top of the show, our guest advertised has not arrived as yet.
But these things
we could do, but when we don't know. But we do have another guest, as Paul said, Nick Kyle, who was on standby. He could be on in 10 minutes if Cameron doesn't.
Yeah, and Alison's doing moderating. Big Bird, Linny's in, Dragonborn, Mrs. Linny. Pete will be listening. I hope you're feeling a bit better, mate. Oh, 1 second. What did I do with it? Look at this. Right.
What's that for?
If anybody remembers, Pat Adams-Wright used to be a great supporter of Truth Proof, and she passed away, I don't know, 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. And today I received Pat's personal singing bowl, and I treasure that, to be honest with you, because what a lovely lady. So thank you. And that was really kind of her. And
yeah, great supporter of the show, wasn't she?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So until Nick Kyle arrives, and I see my daughter Jess is in, hit me with a question, people, or somebody. Let's just, Martin Abbas, let's just kick things around a bit rather than just sit here.
Yeah.
And grandma, go on.
I just picked up a little thing of watching a few YouTube videos, as you know. I was watching a once mainstream reporter called Russ Coulthard. Do they call him?
Oh, yeah. Ross Coulthard, yeah.
Ross Coulthard, yeah. And he's doing some interesting things, because he looked into the Grush hearings and all that last year, and he's pretty knowledgeable now. Now the fact is, I'm picking up on, and you've got to listen to these people. The fact that this subject now is like a growing snowball, Paul. This is what I'm getting. This is what I'm hearing. This is the feeling I'm getting. Is that this is getting bigger, and people want to know more, and definitely want to know about disclosure and things like that even more now.
Do you think this? Oh, in chat thinks disclosure is going to happen. Who thinks we're going to get it? Because I personally don't. I think we're getting it constantly. I think it's, even if it's subliminally and nobody's doing it on purpose, I think everywhere's got sort of connotations to unexplained phenomena, video games, films, everything. It's the drip feed. It's becoming the norm for children, isn't it? And everything's just alien, UFO related, spooky related. And like you said, it's a snowball that's building. And I'm looking, I can see, right, hold on, Brett Biro Artist, and we need to get Brett's artwork up and show people just how good this man is. And what's he said? Paul, when is he going to be chatting with Steve Neal? I don't know, mate, but we'll have to get that one organised for sure. And I see Andy Decodes. If you couldn't invest, right, go on then.
Yeah, I've got these.
Go on, Andy.
Yeah, if you couldn't investigate at Bempton again, where would you go instead if you couldn't go there, actually, Paul?
Good question, Andy. And do you know what, mate? I say Bempton, probably because that's the hub where we park up and get onto the cliffs. If I wanted to go anywhere, I'd probably end up at Speeton. You know, I'd end up at Speeton, and Speeton, because stick a pin in a map, Bempton's the spot, but fanning out from there, only a mile and a half away, and everything seems to happen. I'm going to stop now with this because
we've got some good news, guys.
Yeah, we've been really fortunate, and I've got no questions prepared for this guy, so I'll be winging it a bit, people. But I know that Nick's an absolutely incredible speaker, and Kyle, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Paul.
Yeah, and welcome to the show. So what it is then, Nick, I'll be taking questions probably from people in the chat, if you don't mind answering any of those later on in the show, and then I'll come back on the screen then. So
one sec before you go, Les. If Grant Cameron should arrive, I'd hate to be rude. We might end up with 4 people on screen. Is that how we're going to play it? You'll have to speak to Grant in background, Les, and tell him if possible.
I'll step out of it, Paul. I can come and see you next week or another time.
No, we're so looking forward to speaking to you next week. So even better today. So okay then, thank you.
So I'll see you guys a little bit later.
Great stuff. So I've got nothing prepared, as I said, but we've got Nick Kyle talking to us. I first met Nick at the Awakening conferences, and we didn't have long enough to speak. I wish we had have done. But we've got an hour and 3/4 now, or just over. And Nick's going to share his extensive work and research I'm going to say within the field of unexplained phenomena, because what particular genre, Nick, and welcome to Truth Proof, by the way, I should have said that. What particular genre are we going to focus on tonight?
I would like to share with people evidence that in my own experience, which is corroborated, for discarnate beings incarnating, manifesting, appearing, and able to be physically touched. Some people would call it physical mediumship, but it doesn't have to be a spiritualist phenomena. It might be an interdimensional phenomena. And that's been my main interest. I regard it as the gold standard of human and non-human intelligence coming through and being able to be touched. And I'm happy to tell you the story, but you tell me, Paul, what you're most interested in.
No, I think that we let you go with what you're happy with, Nick. But I'm curious first, where did you start out? Did you start out with the UFO phenomena? Or we call it the phenomena of the UFO. Did you have an experience during childhood? Yeah. Let's hear a little bit about Nick Kyle and where you are with it.
I'm the son of a pastor, and he had a church in a little West Highland village called South Ballyhoolish. For those of you who know the west of Scotland, if you know Glencoe, I grew up for several years of my childhood in the neighbouring village to Glencoe. And I never knew about psychic type experiences when I was only 8 years old. But what I did know was that certain rocks, certain stones and boulders had an energy. And it was comfortable to sit in that energy. Sometimes I would go fishing and sit by the river, but I had particular spots even if I wasn't fishing. And it wasn't that I could see anything, but I could feel in my body a pulsating energy. And those of you who know the area know that there are slate quarries in and around Ballyhoolish. And those quarries had a different sort of energy again. So before I had the vocabulary, I knew that they were earth energies and that I was sensitive to them.
Okay.
In my adult life, I've never really come across earth energies like that. the way I experienced it in childhood, except in one place. And it won't be unique, but it's just my own limited experience. It was in the west side of the island of Iona. Most people go to the east side where the abbey is and the villages and the ferry and so on. But if you cross the narrow island and look out to the Atlantic, some of the stones on the foreshore have a similar energy. And it's almost as if they pulse in your vision. But no matter how close you look, they're not actually moving, but the energy's there.
Right.
So that was around about the age of 8 or 9. When I got to secondary school, I began to hear a few voices. They weren't explainable really, and I was a little confused. So I turned to one of the religious leaders of the church that I was associated with. And I couldn't really speak to my father, God bless him, because he would have disapproved.
Yeah, I was just
And
going to ask you that.
Yeah, this person said to me, "It's the Holy Spirit, Nick. Don't worry about it." He said, "It happens to me sometimes when I preach a sermon and I have an inspirational speech, almost words come out of nowhere." He said, "That's probably what's happening to you." Well, I had too much respect for the man to disagree with him. But I knew it probably wasn't the Holy Spirit because it sounded like my grandmother.
Nick, just sorry for butting in. Did you heard this inside your head, not out externally?
Yes. Yeah. And it was my grandmother. She sounded like my grandmother. She seemed to know about me. She shared with me some memories that only her and I would know about. A very simple thing was, she said to a spirit person who was able to link with me. So this was indirectly, but still, if you like, inside my head. She said, "Tell him I'm holding up a cross and it's not a crucifix because he knows the difference and he'll understand why." Just a few days before my grandmother passed, she rejected her Roman Catholic upbringing and accepted a different sort of spiritual relationship with the God of her understanding. So that was an example. And she would come back from time to time to give me advice. When I went to university, that's when I really started to read about all sorts of things. My grandmother used to read tea leaves before she died, teacups, and she gave herself a bit of a fright because she was so accurate. My mother, who's still alive, thank God, she saw her first UFO when I was just a babe in arms. And I checked. I did some research and I checked, and sure enough, the next day the newspapers carried the story of that particular unidentified flying object flying over the area of our home, not identifying our home, but the area as it transversed. I read more and more, and I had some friends who were very religious and who disapproved. They said that basically this was the work of the devil, even although it only seemed to do good for me. Right. And I began to realize that there were people around that had studied these things and could talk about them. And one that is so advertised was the late Professor Archie Roy. Now, he was at the University of Glasgow and he held a few years, I think, of lectures on spiritualism and spiritualist phenomena. And I attended some of these lectures, and with a physics professor friend of mine, we asked him at the end of a sequence of lectures, was there going to be a more advanced series? And he said, "No, I'm afraid not." He said, "But because I recognize there's a need, I'm going to set up a society and we'll style it after the SPR in London and we'll call ourselves the Scottish SPR, or to give it its full title, the Scottish Society for Psychical Research." Right, okay. And I attended, I got on the committee, I investigated cases for 10, 15 years, And then Archie was in poor health, and I was asked to take over for 10 years. And I was president for that time, right up until the point where I left the SSPR, but only because I wanted to travel the world. And I had resigned my job in teaching to do that. So I couldn't run the SSPR and be in South America, for example. So I've been investigating hauntings and psychic claimants and all sorts of ghost experiences for about 35 years, maybe longer now if I include bang up to date. And in all of that time, I've adopted an open-minded skepticism. I listen to what people say, and my favorite response is maybe. Maybe. Let's look for the evidence. And I'll be honest, Paul, in the vast majority of cases, there's not much evidence. As someone once said to me, you're not investigating the paranormal, Nick, you're investigating reports of past phenomena.
Yeah.
You're a bit like a journalist arriving after the event.
I feel like that myself when I'm gathering these accounts, and that's why we end up on the cliff tops. And where I know where you're going with this, and you've actually been at the coalface, haven't you? Yeah.
And I was told by the vice president of the SSPR when I was going out in my very first case, he said, "What do you think we're going to be doing this evening, Nick?" And I said, investigating the paranormal. And he said, no. I was quite disappointed. I thought that's exactly what I was doing. And he said, no, you'll be investigating people's reports of things that have happened to them in the past. Perhaps the recent past, but still the past. Now, he was mainly correct because that is mainly true. But sometimes when I arrived, I could see the spirit people standing waiting for me. Not all of them were happy to see me. Some had some complaints to make about the people that were living in their house, sort of thing. But when I couldn't see them, and I don't often see them, I could hear them and I could experience touch and a feeling of differences in energy and temperature. So I've got long experience of that. But I was also friendly with the late, great, may I say, Albert Best, the adopted uncle of George Best's family. He lived in Glasgow, and he was known worldwide as a healer and a medium. And what that man demonstrated to me, I'll take to the grave. It was phenomenal. Let me give you just one example for your audience.
As many as you like. That's what I was going to ask. Let's have some examples of this, please. Yeah.
I used to listen to him. The way it worked out was, I went to a spiritualist church in Glasgow, and a little Irishman stepped on the platform. This was my first visit to the church in 6 years, and I had only been once before. So I don't think I was known or remembered by anyone. And I didn't have any kind of public profile, I think. So I'm sitting there, and there were roughly 60 people in the audience. And this little Irishman stood on the platform and pointed to me and said, "I've got your 2 children here." And I deliberately brought down the shutters. I didn't react. I didn't want to give him any inclination that he was correct. And he said, "That's right, isn't it? You do have 2 children in spirit." He said, "They're here." And he took his left and his right hand as if he was grabbing them by the hand, and he was moving his hands up and down. And he said, "They're jumping for joy," because they said, "This is the first time ever we've been able to speak to our daddy." Now, what nobody knew, I think, was that I did have 2 children that died around childbirth. One was a stillborn baby, and one was a very late termination on doctor's advice. But that was not something I ever spoke about.
How did it make you feel, Nick?
Oh, I felt choked with emotion to think that I had rejected my mainstream Christian beliefs, and I didn't think that babies continue to grow up in heaven, sort of thing. So I was quite taken aback, but he was correct in what he said. He said, you know what? He said, they're jumping for joy. He said, that's our daddy. But who's that woman sitting there pointing to my right? Because that's not our mummy. The person I was sitting with was my girlfriend, my marriage having failed.
I see.
Nobody knew that. Nobody, Paul. And he said it the way I'm saying it to you, very straightforward. So after the service, when it was over, I asked if I could speak with him privately to arrange a one-to-one sitting or reading. And the man who was at the door laughed out loud. And he said, join the queue. You and the rest of the planet would like a reading with this man. His name was Albert Best.
Right.
He said he's only doing a fundraiser tonight. He's stopped working. He's almost retired. I hear he doesn't do any work now except when it involves children. Okay. I attended the church for another few weeks. I experienced another few messages. None of them were as impressive or accurate or precise as what Albert had said. And then the doorman, who was one of the church committee members, stood up and said, we're looking for a volunteer to run a church magazine. We can't pay you, but we'd really appreciate the help. I waited behind and said to the man, I'll do your magazine for you at no charge. I said, there's only one condition. He said, what's that? I said that the first issue has to have it on its front cover an interview with Albert Best, and I have to be the person doing the interview.
Yeah.
So I turned up at Albert's door. He lived in a little Glasgow flat, a tenement we call it. And I turned up with a bottle of whiskey, and Albert opened the door for the interview, and he smiled. He said, did someone tell you to bring that whiskey so it would loosen my tongue? And I said, well, they didn't say that, Albert. I said, but I was kind of hoping it might be true.
Might be,
And he said, come on in. And that started a really wonderful friendship. I would visit him once a week or thereabouts, and then he would visit me in the intervening weeks. And I was friendly with him for about 6.5, 7 years before he himself passed. So that's how I got to know him. And one night he said, would you like to experience a healing, Nick? And I said, yes. And he said, well, come over to my house because I'm having a healing session. And I turned up, and as did a woman with a young man. He would have been about 19, maybe 17 years of age. And he was in a wheelchair. And he had hydrocephalus, which for those that don't know the meaning of it, it's fluid in the brain. And his mother had brought him along to Albert because of Albert's reputation as a healer. But she came along saying, we've just had a cancer diagnosis. My son has been told he has a cancerous tumor, and it's inoperable where it is, and he's got a short time to live, a few months at best. And Albert sat down, closed his eyes, and began to speak in German. Now, I'm not fluent in German, but I could tell it was German. And I knew that one of Albert's guides was a doctor, a medical doctor who had been German in his earth life. And Albert stood up, put his fingers out and touched the young man on his forehead, just very lightly, very briefly. And as he pulled the fingers away, there was a dark globular mass attached to his fingertips. And he put it into a bowl of water that was held for him, rinsed his hands, was given a towel, and dried his hands off and sat back down.
You witnessed this?
I saw this, and there was nothing like my own arms. There was nothing there that could have been sleight of hand under a shirt or something. But in any case, Albert wasn't interested in that kind of entertainment. And I looked and I thought, am I really seeing the psychic surgery? So I kept in touch with the woman. I got her phone number. She gave me permission to call. She said her son had an appointment in a week or two. So I waited 2 or 3 weeks, and then I phoned her and said, how is your son now? Really not expecting too much. And she said, oh, we got an apology. I said, an apology? For what? She said, oh, the doctor said he must have mixed up my son's x-rays or scan results with another patient, because my son doesn't have a cancerous tumour now, and there's no evidence that he ever did.
Amazing. And Nick, that was the only proof that you would ever need, isn't it? You know?
Yeah, but I've had more. I've had all sorts of evidences. Let me give you another couple of quick ones.
There's no rush, Nick. There's no rush. But we want to talk skull, because I know that they're interested. But we're here for 2 hours, or well, not now, but you know, an hour and a half, and there'll be some questions at 8 p.m. I'm hoping now that Grant doesn't come. No disrespect to Grant, but we can talk to Grant next week. Fire away.
Okay. So let me tell you a story that didn't involve me as a witness, except later on.
Yeah.
Albert was asked to go to a hospital as an emergency. There was a little infant child. I'm not sure the age of the child, let's say a few months old. A babe in arms is what it was described to me. And it was dying. And Albert turned up, and the family were all round the cot, and he lifted the child in his arms, and his guide said to him, I think telepathically, no one else in the room heard this, and the guide said, "You're too late, Albert. The call has already gone out for this one." And Albert looked at the faces of the family, and of course he was moved. They were so expectant and so hoping he could perform a miracle. He put the child back in the cot and went outside to try and regain his own composure and have a cigarette. You were allowed to smoke in the grounds at that time. And I don't know how much time passed. It would have been a few minutes, maybe 15. And suddenly there was a shout from within the ward. "Where's Mr. Best? Tell Mr. Best to come now. Tell him to come right now." So he threw a cigarette away, ran along the corridor, came into the room, scooped the child up in his arms, and the child took one breath and died. And Albert put the child back in the cot and said, "How did you know when to call me?" They said, "We didn't." The child's face turned to that of an old man. He had a brownish face, very wrinkled, and he said in a gruff voice, "Tell Mr. Best to come, and come quickly." So we shouted for you. And Albert said to me, "That was my guide. That was my Arab guide. I know him like he's my brother." And that's who they were describing.
Really?
Now, he was an Irishman. He could tell a good story. I believed him because he never told me a lie. But at the same time, it sounded fantastic.
Yeah.
Really difficult to kind of believe if you're not used to that sort of thing. And it was years later, when Albert was poorly and I was visiting in hospital, that there was a young man standing, I would guess late 20s. And Albert said to me in a rather croaky, weak voice, "Nick, before you leave, have a word with this person here." He said, and I said, "Certainly, Albert, but why? What's the reason?" And he said, "Because I know how skeptical you are, and he's got something to say to you that will help you with your problem." So I went outside at the end of the visiting, and before I departed in a different direction, said to the young man, "What was Albert wanting us to speak about?" And he said, "Did he tell you about a child who died in hospital and he was there and his face changed?" And I said, "Yes, he did." He said, "Well, I'm a witness to that because it was my brother." And I was standing there and I saw the whole thing. And that's why I visit Albert to this day.
Yeah. And
so
it's
another example really of remarkable corroboration of what's really a miracle, I suppose, if you've not seen transfiguration or overshadowing like that. Albert did many things, many healings and remarkable healings. One of the things that he did for me was early in the conversation, he said to me, "Nick, we can be friends, in which case you might never get a reading, a meeting, a message." He said, "Or I can treat you like a client, give you a reading right now and send you away. Which would you rather have?
I know what you chose.
Yeah. I said, well, I'd rather have the friendship, Albert, because I can get my own messages.
Yeah.
Even though I was making a joke of it, I wasn't
Yeah.
so confident. And I said, and I've learned so much from you already. I'd like to spend much more time in your company as a friend. And that was the agreement. Years passed. And a wife of a friend of mine phoned me and said, Nick, can you help? My husband, your friend, is going to commit suicide. And he's told me it's going to happen in 2 weeks' time. And I said, how can I help? You know, he lived on the other side of Scotland. How can I help? She said, well, he says that you know about the next life, the afterlife. And he's got questions about what will happen when he kills himself. Could you tell him what will happen? And maybe it'll put him off. And I said, I don't think I can do that, but I'll try. So he came through to Glasgow, and I phoned Albert. And I said, Albert, I've got someone who's thinking...
Well, I'm just cutting across just one for one reason, because the story's amazing. So I want you to pick it up. We'll just not use the word "suey." The YouTuber disapproves of the word end of life.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So what happened was I phoned Albert and said, I have a friend. He's very depressed, and he's looking to me for help. I think you're the best person to help him, Albert. And Albert said, okay, but he wasn't as friendly as he usually is, because I was actually breaking a promise. I was asking him to do something to do with mediumship for me.
Right.
But Albert saw him, and as Albert took him into his lounge, or we call it in Scotland, the living room, he sent me into his bedroom and he closed the door. And as he was closing the door, I heard him say, welcome, your mother's here. And he named her. Just in the action of closing the door and saying, sit down, your mother's here. And he named her. He then said, and you know the funny thing about it? He said she still prays to the saints that she used to pray when she was here on earth. And he named them, the one saint in particular, but one other too. And she said, she doesn't want you to kill yourself, because you will not be with her if you do that until your appointed time. She wants you to stop feeling guilty about your brother. Now, I didn't know what she was talking about, but he did.
Obviously did. Yeah.
He let his brother's hand go, and his brother was killed in front of him on the motorway. He never forgave himself for that.
Yeah.
And Albert was able to say, your mother says, stop blaming yourself for what happened to your brother. Now, that man is still alive today, many years later, running his own business, and a good deal happier.
Yeah.
He still doesn't know what to believe about post-death, but he's very open-minded because he's had evidence.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. And
now I could go on and tell you similar stories about this one medium, but I'll not. What I'll do is I'll switch to, so what did Spirit do for Albert? We hear what Albert did for other people, but what did Spirit do for Albert?
And is Albert still with us? Because I'm sure.
No.
No, right. Okay.
No, he died, I think it was 12 years ago.
Okay.
I said to Albert, has Spirit ever done anything fantastic, miraculous for you, Albert? And he said, well, I think they helped me stay alive when I was during the war. I was captured, and I was lined up beside the ditch, and the German machine gunned everybody, including me. He said, and I landed in the ditch, and a body landed on top of me, and they still kept firing into the ditch. He said, but they only blew off part of my hand, pinky, really. And he said, and then the other wounds were flesh wounds. He said, but as I'm lying in the ditch thinking I'm going to die, waiting for the bullets to come into me, I heard a voice saying, you have to get up, Albert, and you have to leave here and go to, and they mentioned a location in North Africa. That's where he'd been captured. And Albert said, but if I get up, they'll see me and they'll kill me for sure. And I think he lapsed into unconsciousness. But when he came to, it was darker. There were searchlights. He did get out the ditch. He wasn't seen. And the following morning at dawn, having walked across the desert, he came to an oasis in the desert that had been named by the spirit voice in his head. He then came back to the UK through the Italian underground, and when he arrived in his native Belfast, he couldn't find his home. It had been completely obliterated in the Belfast Blitz. His wife and 3 children, I think it was 3, had all been killed.
Right.
And he lapsed into what he calls a nervous breakdown. And he moved to Scotland to be with members of his family, adopted family, and he became a postman. And he became known as the psychic postman because if an envelope was not addressed or not properly addressed, he could hold it to his head and read the contents. Or he could give the correct address, and sure enough, when it was delivered, the people said, yeah, this is the letter for me. And the bosses used to come down from Glasgow and ask him to demonstrate this, which he did successfully, apparently, more than once or twice. That was Albert's early career, if you like, with that tragedy. And it was many years later when he was on a world tour and he's left Australia and he was heading up through Africa to go back to London, where he was staying at that time. And he was traveling with another medium. He wasn't on his own. And the other medium said, I've got spirit here saying we need to stop en route. You have to get a message, Albert. And Albert was a bit irritated because he was hot, he was bored, it was a very long journey. And he said, no, forget it, you're wrong. I'm not doing it. So the medium, that was Albert's companion, said to the driver privately, take a slight detour and go to this particular village. It was really. And when Albert stopped outside the village and realized he'd been tricked, he was really not too happy. But the medium said, look, all we're asking you to do is walk round the inner circle of these mud huts. And then if nothing happens, we'll come back into the vehicle and drive on. So Albert was walking around this circle of mud huts with almost no one around. He said the place was pretty much empty. And as he walked past a particular hut, mud brick walls, a thatched kind of roof with a hole in the top for the smoke to go out. A black man came out of that hut and said, are you Mr. Best from London? And Albert thought this was part of the trick. So he said, yes, what of it? He said, come in, we've been waiting for you. Spirit say that they have got people that are desperate to see you. And Albert thought it was local villagers.
I know where you're going with this as well. Yeah, but fill us in. Yeah.
So he went into the mud hut. There was a fire in the centre. The guy who turned out to be the medicine man for the village put Albert on the other side of the fire, reached into a pouch, brought out some dust, threw it in the fire, mini explosion of smoke. And when the smoke drifted away, Albert's wife and children were standing. And the children came running round the fire and leapt into his lap and hugged him and kissed him and spoke to him. Then his wife came over, more hugs, more kisses. And Albert said he was overcome with emotion. He didn't expect it. He almost turned it down, the opportunity. But he met and touched and hugged and spoke with his wife and kids. And they told him they were waiting for him and what life was like. And it was good. And Albert said, I don't know how many minutes I was with them. It could have been 3, it could have been 15. He said, but I can tell you this, it wasn't long enough.
Can I just cut in there, Nick? But obviously, because I don't understand this, that's why I'm asking you. And it's a great account that you're sharing with us, and other people might be asking the same. The physical. How hard would it have been for these spirit beings, the people that have passed over, to become physical?
It would have been very difficult. It would have required energy. A gifted individual, like the medicine man, probably acted as a sort of medium too.
Are they working through other people's energy, though?
I think it varies. I think it varies according to different situations. But the short answer would be probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But just to finish the story, when the medicine man intervened and said, "Mr. Best, you have to let them step back because the energy is going," Albert was very reluctant, but he did let them go. And when they stepped on the other side of the fire, he said they evaporated like snow, just coming down, and there was nothing there. And he said, supposing nothing else happens and I get no more mediumistic communications, I will live and die knowing there is another life.
Yeah,
because I experienced it for my own evidence, not just for what I've given other people. And some of the things he's given other people, without going into a long list, I was with him when he pointed to 4 people in the audience and he said, "You're all here because your brother drowned. He was out hill walking and he fell into a bog and he couldn't get out and he went under and he drowned." And they all said, yes. I think 2 or 3 of them were sisters. And he said, "Well, I'm here to tell you he didn't drown, he was murdered." He said he was held under, but he was murdered. And he said, "And I know I can give you the name of the person who was with him, and you can give it to the police." And Albert did that. I never followed that up to see if it was accurate. To be honest, by then, I knew him to be accurate, so I didn't feel that I needed to. On another occasion, my wife's quite a good cook. Probably I should say a very good cook. And
you should do if you want feeding.
Yeah, and she used to make good plain Irish cooking for Albert when he visited her home. And one night Albert said he phoned up to say, "Look, I can't come tonight," which was very unusual. And we said, "Oh, okay, is there a reason?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I've got a guest arriving at no notice, and she's coming just when I'm supposed to be coming to you for dinner." And I said, "Bring your guest." And he said, "Well, she's a married woman." Albert, you old sea dog, you're fraternizing with a married woman, are you? And he said, "Oh, no, it's not like this." He said, "She was a guest of the Queen and she's coming up to see me while she's in Britain."
I see.
Okay. She's an Irish Maharini, a princess, if you like. And her husband is the Indian Foreign Secretary.
Right.
So she arrives in a taxi with Albert, dripping with gold jewellery, and she spoke in a cultivated English accent. And I said to her, how did you get to know Albert?" And she said, "Get this. Albert told my son he was going to be killed by one of his own men. And my son ignored Albert, and he was murdered by one of his own security men."
Right.
She said, "But I didn't expect my son to come through Albert and to speak in our local Urdu dialect." Now, I'm saying Urdu. It might have been a different Indian dialect, but it might have been Hindi or something. But whatever it was, she said, I thought maybe I would hear from my son that he's alive, but I didn't expect him to speak to me in an Indian local dialect that would only be known to my son and his family, because that's what we use when we're in private. But enough of Albert. If people want to know more about him, there is some information online, and there is a book out there that was written about him, and he has gone now. gone in the sense he's not in this 3D physical world the same way. But I've been told he sometimes is with me when I'm out.
You must be reading my mind, because we said enough of Albert, and I know we're going to move to some questions because these people want to talk about Skull. However, I was just going to say to you, this guy, this absolutely incredible medium, as he tried to communicate, as he tried to contact you, have you felt his presence?
Yeah. You remember I said to you he'd been shot in the hand?
Yeah.
Sometimes I look at my left hand and it cramps just the way Albert's used to, especially when he was smoking a cigarette. These two fingers would be cramped in, and I would feel I had no pinky.
Right, okay.
I would feel as if I had to look and check. And then the mannerisms and the feeling of a message would come through. But not often, Paul. I have to be honest and say that early on, maybe happened half a dozen times. And then it began to fade. And other mediums would say, Albert Best's walking with you. But I always put that down to the fact by that time I was known for having an interest in mediumship and the paranormal. So I always just assumed that they're saying that to impress me because they knew about my friendship with Albert.
Yeah.
Maybe now, looking back, I should have been more open-minded to the possibility, and maybe he would have communicated more.
Yeah, no, it's fabulous, and thank you for sharing that information about your, well, not just a medium, but your friend, a really good friend. Yeah. And I'm gonna, hopefully, we've got a few questions. I'm gonna jump to Les, probably 5 minutes earlier than normal. Put a thumbs up, Les, if we've got any questions. Yeah, we have.
Yeah, sure. And
thank you, Nick.
Yeah, the first 2 or 3 questions are just for you, Paul. So we'll get these out the way. Yeah, and let's have a look with this one. We've got Hizo 64HH. Paul, will you ever speak about Mr. and Mrs. Tick? If you could, what would you ask them now? So
I don't know as I ever will, to be honest. Out of everything in that book, Night People, that was the one that I really, were reluctant even to. I didn't even know if I was going to include it. I nearly didn't even bother trying to publish Night People because of that story. The people in the book, Mr. and Mrs. Tick, frightened me to death. One thing I'll ask Nick, don't have to answer this one now, but do you think, well, you could do if you want, do you think talking about such things, actually, it's almost like something's eyes open up and you're on the radar because it's everywhere. The other side, the other side of the firewall, it's as though if we think it, they know it. And this particular story frightened me, and that's why I've never spoken about it. So thanks for bringing it up, Rizo, but no, thank you.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things to say about fear. But you want me to hold that back, Paul, in case we'll
get through these questions, Nick, but I'll just make a note of fear on that note. Yeah, go on then.
Okay, Steve 071. Paul, can you give us some info on what has happened with your skull experiments so far? And,
well,
probably tell people who don't already know. Yeah,
I've got a guy here who's got far more experience of it than me, but we've not called it skull. I've just called it Trojan, and we're only probably 4 or 5 weeks in, and we have had the marginal results. I think I maybe spoke to Nick about this, but if he hasn't, I will do at some point. I'm reluctant to, because I know this guy's got the lowdown on what happened at the actual skull experiments. But thanks, Steve-O. We'll get through mine quick.
Alderham, Paul, have you ever thought of doing a tour of East Yorkshire of areas of high strangeness?
It's a great idea, Al, isn't it? You know, I've thought about getting a minibus, seriously, a people carrier. And not doing it to make great amounts of money, but you could literally visit these areas. Now, I wonder how many people would be interested. And you could literally drive and talk, stop and walk, and you could actually. Obviously, the chances, as as Nick knows and as Les knows and everybody in chat, the unexplained phenomena usually does not perform to order. So the chances of us seeing or experienced anything would be minimal, but we could talk the accounts and sort of relive the moments. I think it would be a great idea, Al. Thank you.
Okay,
Right.
and I think we're back onto questions for Nick. Mark Jones, quite a few books behind you, Nick. Do you have a favourite book?
Oh, there's a question I would have to think about. Yeah, I do have quite a few books, and most of them are in the paranormal, or psychology, or science. And I've got another room with another library of a similar size. I used to like any books that taught me something about the paranormal that I didn't know. But now I'm interested in books of people who can walk the talk, who can actually do things, who take action, rather than sit back and pontificate as an armchair critic. So I don't really have a favourite book. My father would want me to say, how about the Bible? Because in his estimation, the Bible is the greatest book ever written. And I was brought up to know it inside out. What I would say is the Bible is institutionalized paranormality. It's full of paranormal stories.
Yeah.
It's full of mediumship. Lots of people like to think of Christ as the greatest living medium. But no, that's a really good question, Mark. I'll be thinking about that, Mark,
Think about that
after tonight's over.
Yeah.
And if he thinks of a book, Mark, he'll tell us.
I don't know if you see that one. Mark Anderson is asking, Nick, can you please tell us some of the best SSPR cases?
If that's the Mark Anderson I know, then I can tell him privately. But here's the problem. All the SSPR cases that I've ever done, and this would apply to any of the investigators from the SSPR, confidentiality is assured, and it's never really been broken to my knowledge. So I could tell you an anonymized case in which it wouldn't be possible to identify the family, but it's not nearly so interesting because it could be so easily made up. Yeah. If you can't pin it down to a particular person or who the corroborating witnesses were, I don't think it works really for an audience to hear it. But I'll give you one case. I'll stretch it to two only if you insist, Mark. Just a few years ago, I was contacted by a businessman who said, before I reveal anything about what's happening with me and my family, he said, I would like to ask you a question. How do you protect yourself from an invisible assailant? How do you protect your family from an attacking entity? A destructive, unwanted, ghostly visitor. And I said, with great difficulty. And he said, then you better come and see me, because we're currently living in one room of our home, and there are 5 adults here, and we're terrified. So I went to this house. It was a kind of 3-story house, an old Georgian Edwardian type villa. And as always with SSPR cases, we go in mixed pairs. So I went with my wife, and on another occasion there was a female investigator there. And initially we simply got the story. And the story was that there were 3 females, adult females, who were daughters of the couple. They were more mature and they were running a business. Of the 3 daughters, 2 were undergraduates and 1 was a graduate. So they were, if you like, educated and knowledgeable and articulate. And they said, basically, we one of the daughters, the graduate, didn't believe in any of this rubbish, any of this nonsense. She shut it off, literally shutting her bedroom door. She was never really bothered herself. The other two sisters were open-minded, or maybe slightly believing in the possibility. And one of them used to find her room trashed. She would come home and she would find that heavy furniture was thrown around and drawers were emptied and so on. And then she felt a presence watching her when she was in the bathroom or undressing and so on. And then she was lifted by her ankles into the air by an invisible male entity. And the significant thing about this was her sister was with her, holding her to the bed by her head and shoulders, while her feet were being tugged up into the air. The light was a single light bulb on a single wire, and if you hit it, as you can imagine, initially it would go backwards and forwards, but eventually it would go round. Try it with any light bulb, but with this one, it would point jaggedly at one corner and then point jaggedly at another, as if in some way there was a magnetic force or a hand pulling it in that direction. There was no circularity. There was no indeterminate movement. And the mother said, someone's trashing the basement. That's where I do my laundry, and we're doing a bit of DIY there. And we come home sometimes, nobody's broken in, and the basement's everything's strewn everywhere. And it's a similar thing going on in the loft, which was the top story. And as the mother was speaking to us, she reacted very severely, as if she was grabbed by the throat and lifted into the air, and that was in front of us. Now, she was either a Hollywood actress who was misplaced, or indeed she was acting and behaving truthfully. My memory is it took 3 visits to get rid of this thing, but my wife said to me that we actually made 5 visits, but they weren't all of the same length or duration. So it might be my memory, but I remember 3 visits in particular, because on the first visit, I met a man standing in the basement in spirit. And I said to him, "Are you the guy that's causing all the trouble down here?" And he went into a rage and he said, "Me? Have you seen the place? Look around you." He said, "They're treating it like a rubbish dump, and cement bags against the wall, cement dust everywhere. Look, they even leave their clothes on the ground. I would never have allowed this when I lived here." And then I realized who he was. He was a doctor, and it was his servants who lived in the lower part of the house. And he was furious because he still regarded this as his own house. Now, I did spend some time communing with him, as it were, speaking with him. And eventually I said to him, "A man of your caliber, sir, a man of your professionalism and upbringing and Hippocratic oath as a doctor, would not wish to be known as someone who liked to torment young ladies, young women, and upset a mother in her own home." And he looked at me, turned on his heel, and walked out a first floor window, as if it was ground floor. He just disappeared. Never came back.
Okay.
I contacted the family 7 years later. He's never returned. But there were also ghostly things happening in the loft. And that was children. That was ghost children. They were having a great time, and they're hiding in amongst the bags of, not rubbish, but I think clothing. And they were moving things, and they were giggling when people could hear and come up, and they would look around. And it was all a fun time. Now, I used my best teacher's voice. I used to be a teacher, school teacher. And I said to them, "Let's have no more of this. You've had your fun. Now it's time to move on. And don't make me bring adults from your side to take you away." They also stopped their nonsense, and I think there was a vague feeling of a presence for a few days, but there was nothing else happened that involved banging noises or things getting thrown around. So what about the attack? Well, that's why it took 3 visits, because this guy wasn't for leaving. He was in the spirit world and he liked the young lady concerned. And I'll not elaborate for your guests what he had in mind, but he was told he would either leave voluntarily or he would be taken. And he chose the latter option. So I worked with spirit guides and I asked them to sort this guy out, and they did. And he's never been back in 7 years either.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
Channel 4 wanted to do a documentary, and they wanted a case where there were multiple witnesses to phenomena, but it hadn't reached the public domain. It hadn't been the subject of a previous article or so on. And I contacted the family to say, look, your case falls into that category, because in the last 6 years at that time, I said, I've not told anybody anything about you. Nobody can identify you. And the guy said, we'll do it. And we'll do it for the very simple reason. You never charged us a penny. You never told anybody else. And you sorted the problem. But I wasn't encouraging him to work with a TV series because I knew what would happen. And he would get identified and maybe problems would return. And eventually he concluded that that's what the documentary filmmakers wanted. They wanted a shot of his house. They wanted him to be identified as a local business owner. And I can say to you, it's in the west of Glasgow in the Renfrewshire area. And I agreed with him that he shouldn't do it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I've got a question, but I want Les to get through some of these questions. Have we got some, Les?
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Yeah, that one, Nick. Right, I've got a question from Debbie Shaw. What advice would Nick give to anyone thinking of doing their own version of the skull experiments?
I would probably discourage them, and for all sorts of reasons. First of all, note the reason the skull experimental team stopped their own experiments. There were 4 of them towards the end, Robin and Sandra Foy and Alan Diana Bennett. And they were told by their spirit team of communicators, we have to stop. This is becoming dangerous. And when Robin said, what do you mean? What's the nature of the danger? They said there are time travelers wanting to get back into this era, and they're looking for a porthole or an energy doorway in which to do it. We aren't used to this intrusion. We don't think we can stop them except by closing that energy door, by stopping the connection we've got. We might come back to it in the future, but we really don't want to allow this. And they stopped.
Right. Okay.
So if somebody was doing their own version of the skull experiments, perhaps if they thought they were successful in getting phenomena, they may get more than they bargained for. But there's another reason. I would say that the skull experiments are probably the most impressive set of experiments demonstrating physical mediumship that I've ever witnessed. And I only sat in 2 of their sittings. But what I experienced there was way on another level beyond what normally happens in spiritualist circles. And I've been in lots of them, including in my own home and local spiritualist churches. Despite that, there is a sense in which the skull experiments were a failure. Not because they didn't demonstrate phenomena, but they said that the purpose in making this effort was to introduce a new era of man-spirit communication using technology apart from anything else. Well, that technology only worked with the mediums. It didn't work. It was built, the device, similar to what you would think was a wristwatch, was built by a professor of electrical engineering who was one of the school researchers. And it would work, but it was a device that only worked for the mediums, didn't work for anyone else. And the skull experiment stopped at the turn of the century. Do you think there's been a new dawn of man-spirit communication as a result of their efforts? No, I don't. So in that sense, it was a failure. But I'm happy to tell you what happened in the sittings. And if it inspires you and motivates you, Here's a third reason why I wouldn't recommend it. When I came back from the school experiments, I spent 10 years doing my own replications and trying experiments, following guidelines that had been written as a booklet, and trying my own variations as time went on. And I never experienced anything that was different from a normal seance. Table rappings and tappings, little flashes of light, a sense of presence, being touched, and sometimes objects moving, but not in a spectacular fashion. We didn't really get partial or full materializations, such as we had at school. Now, I don't know about you, Debbie, but 10 years is a long time to try something unsuccessfully. And I put in the effort because I had the success.
You knew the reality of it. Yeah.
I just couldn't achieve it. And then I met two mediums in Scotland. And I'm happy to talk about that. But even they would say, so this is a fourth reason, they could replicate the skull phenomena. They could bring through partial and full materializations. They could make objects disappear, go through walls and ceilings and all the rest of it. And I have shook hands with a spirit gentleman and felt up his arm with his permission, and there was no body attached. There was no shoulder. But he's still shaking my hand. And I've got a good, strong grip. I wasn't for letting it go. A child leapt into my lap and asked for a hug.
Don't spoil this, Nick. We're going to do this after some more questions.
Yeah, but this is in Glasgow.
All right.
This isn't in school. And this couple said, we're stopping. And I said, why? This is after about 6 or 7 seances. We've been told it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And I'd heard this before, but this is a different setup. And I said, what makes it dangerous? And the things that the medium told me made me concerned for his life and his well-being. But that is a separate story, which I can talk about with his permission, but I don't want to rant on about it just now.
No, you're not ranting at all. I would just mindful of the fact that we'll do a few more questions if he's got them. Or have you got no more questions, Les?
I'll probably get a couple more out. I don't know how much you can talk on this one because it's just a recent, some recent news. What are your thoughts on Major Carl Nell's latest disclosure statement at the SALT conference this week?
I have to hold my hands up and say I don't know about it.
Yeah, well, I'm in the same camp there. So sorry, O'Connell. Really sorry about that. But
I've done some initial research. It looks interesting. It's probably something we can do on a future show, Paul.
Okay, Les, brilliant.
I've got Big Bird. Les, do you go on paranormal investigations a lot? Well, the answer to that is fairly easy. I don't get the chance to go on a lot of them. I'd love to go on more, but the answer is no, I don't go on a lot.
We've got a couple of days planned to go and do some filming and get out there. Not exactly paranormal investigations, but we'll get to some nice locations. Big Bird, yeah. So,
right, I'll leave you to it, guys.
Yep, brilliant. And once again, just after top of hour, thank you, Nick, because I mean you've just stepped in here and kind of saved our bacon tonight because it was just a time zone mix-up. I've given him right times, but it's not happened. So let's, if you don't mind, then let's stay with the skull experiments. And I know that that's just one faction of what you're involved in, have been involved in, and are involved in now. But I think you've got to admit probably that that's the one that's captured the attention of people interested in the unexplained. So if we can go there.
Okay.
How did you get involved?
Albert Best.
Albert Best.
Yeah, Albert told me when I said to him, Albert, I want to learn about physical mediumship. And I said, I really think it's the gold standard of mediumship, where it's not mental, it's not telepathy, it's not, it's actually spirit coming into the room and walking up to you and shaking hands with you or giving you a hug and talking to you for 45 minutes or 25 minutes, that kind of. And I said, that's what I'm looking for. And I believe it can happen. And Albert said, there's only one group that I know of in England that allows members of the public to attend. And he said, I'll write you a letter of introduction. It's the only thing I can think of where they might let you in. He said, you don't help yourself by being so skeptical. he said, but I'll put in a good word for you. And then Albert died before he gave me the letter. And just a few weeks later, I got an invitation through a spiritualist friend that I had been sitting with in circle for a little while, a year or two. And he said to me, I've been invited down to the school experiments in Norfolk, and I've been told that I can invite up to 4 people. So he said, would you like to come, Nick, and bring your wife? She was also a sitter with me. And the 2 other people at that time stayed in Scotland. And one was a hypnotherapist, and his wife was a trainer for a national company. So we had all sat in various home circles and church circles, and we drove down, and I felt that maybe Albert, after his passing, had some hand in this arrangement. So I was looking forward to seeing what would happen. There was a presentation for, I think it was half a day, maybe a little more, about what to expect. And so if I tell you just the way it happened to me, some of your audience will burst out laughing, because he said it's a dark seance, pitch black. And I said, so how are we going to see? Right? And he said, don't worry about that, Nick. Spirit will light the room up. I said, you mean they'll switch the light on? And he said, no. Spirit will illuminate the room with self-illuminating orbs, and you'll be able to see each other. And I guffawed in laughter. Yes, I had seen orbs before. The briefest flash, you almost think they're in your peripheral vision. You look, they're gone, and so on. I had never been in a situation such as Robin Foy was describing. And then I went down to the cellar room, and I was invited to check it out beforehand. And it was a cement floor, and it was an arched brick cellar, and it was just very roughly 14 feet square.
Okay.
Coffee table in the centre, space for 10 chairs round about, and some of the chairs were hard up against the wall. There was so little space. And there were 4 mediums, so there were 6 visitors. Now, is that right? No, I think there were 14 in total, 10 visitors, 5 from England, 5 from Scotland. Okay. And the lights went out. And then I looked up, and I thought I was looking directly into the cosmos, the Milky Way, in a dark, starry night. There were hundreds of pinpoint lights. And I thought, now that's clever. This is a planetarium with fiber optic cables built into the brickwork.
Skeptic in Nick Kyle still there.
Oh yeah, and it's been painted over white, and they're projecting in 3 dimensions what we're seeing. What nonsense! I mean, I get embarrassed just talking about this because I was so skeptical. And then the lights came down into the room and began to swirl round in a clockwise direction, and I couldn't create a shadow. It didn't matter where I held my hands. It wasn't interrupting a projected light beam. I thought, how are they doing this? There are dozens of lights at some points, but usually 12 to 20, I think, all the time. And if a light passed your face, people in the room could see your face. That was how strong it was.
White lights, are they white? Are they different colours?
They are different colours, but they're mainly white. I would describe them as off-white. Some a little blue, some a little yellow, some a little tinge of green. But you know the way you go into a paint store and they've got 20 variations in white? Well, yes, it was a bit like that, yeah. And that some of the lights would come down into the room and suddenly go through a table. Now, I'd have an interest in conjuring, right? So the way you would do that is you would take an LED and switch it off above the table, and have a second LED and switch it on below the table as it continues the anticipated trajectory, okay? So I thought, that's interesting. That appeared to go through that solid table, but that could be a fix. And then a light came round the room and touched people. And I thought, right, so this isn't a holographic light system,
You can
because
feel
you
it.
wouldn't feel touch. You wouldn't be touched. So I put my hand out and said, no, nothing has touched me so far. And a light shot round 180 degrees, came in front of my palm, and as I turned my hand like that, it bounced in the palm of my hand. And I said out loud, can I hold it? And Robin Foy sort of laughed and said, yeah, if you want. So I went like that. And then I went like that. And I'm turning my hands to see if there's nylon fishing line connecting.
Could you feel something? Could you feel?
Oh, yes. Yes, it was like a little rubber ball. But I didn't squeeze it to make it rubber. It just had that kind of feel and texture. And it was jumping up and down in my hands, but not, I don't think it was trying to escape. I think it was just moving. And as I looked, the light was coming out between my fingers. So it was shining brightly. And then I opened my hand and it jumped up, shone a light in my face, and zoomed round back to where it had been. So I thought, okay, so they're physical lights. This isn't some optical illusion or something. This isn't someone with a fishing line and LED at the end of it, trying to fly fishing silently in the dark. And then a light began to go into people and objects. A light went into a crystal that was levitating above a bowl, and it lit up the crystal. And I could go into another room in my house and show you the crystal, a cluster of white quartz. And when I took it home, the very first time I sat in a home circle with it, it glowed. Nothing near it, it just glowed in the dark. And to give you an idea of the translucence, the illumination, you could hold a printed page beside it and read the printed page in the pitch dark. That was the level of the glow.
The luminosity, yeah.
A week later, there was no glow. There were only tiny little sparks at the point of the crystal. A week after that, there was no glow, no sparks, nothing. And I've had it for 20 years and nothing's happened since. Except I use it sometimes for healing, and healing seems to work. Whether that's to do with the white quartz crystal or not, I can't say.
Okay.
People who know more about crystals than me say, well, have you washed it, Nick? Have you exposed it to the moonlight, and all this sort of stuff? Well, I don't really believe in doing these crystal rituals. So the answer is no. But hey, I'm open to learning, if there is a way to reactivate it. It was a wonderful miracle just in itself. But to go back to school, my wife had a light, an orb, shoot inside her rib cage. And she squealed, not out of pain, but because she could feel it bouncing inside her ribs. And then it came out with a little pop, hovered in the air and shot off again. At no time during the 2 hours of this seance, this circle, did any of the lights collide with each other or people or cause damage or make a mistake. They were all intelligently controlled at speed.
What do you think the lights were, Nick? Were they spirit? What did you come away with? Probably jumping gun here, aren't I? But I'm curious.
I think they are little bubbles of energy in which sometimes spirit can manifest images.
There's got to be intelligence if they're not colliding. If they're not.
The orbs don't have to have the intelligence, but they have to be under the intelligent control.
Okay.
So if you think of it as a bubble of energy, if you're able to move that energy bubble around, then it's not the energy bubble that contains intelligence.
It's the intelligence that's operating it. Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Now, my wife then levitated. Now, think what that means, right? It wasn't a full levitation, like feet into the air. The chair she was on shot backwards, wasn't leaning against the wall, and she couldn't budge it, and she was trying to swing herself to get it back down. And somebody underneath, somebody put the hand underneath and said, I can confirm that, because the light wasn't so strong at foot level, I can confirm that these chair legs are off the ground. there was all sorts of materialization, dematerialized objects. There were apports, there were bells ringing that were hanging with no one's been seen to touch them because the light was quite good. There were objects lifting off the coffee table. A light, as I said earlier, went into one of the crystals and shone. So that was the first visit. And we were told before we took this sitting that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. That Spirit wanted selected scientists and researchers, people with experience and knowledge, to know that this was happening.
Yeah,
and that was
now,
roughly...
How many years did it take to build to that stage? Not you, the guys at school.
I'd need to look back at my notes, but it was approximately 3 or 4 years to go from small successes to this spectacular light show. Prior to that, they had a couple of years where they were sitting with another 2 people and they left. And as a result of them leaving, or after rather they left, the phenomena began to build up. So three and about 4 years. If I look back at my notes, I might want to tweak the time, but it's something of that order. So that was in September 1996. And it fueled my desire and my wife's desire to sit with the same people that I had visited from Scotland, the 3 of them, with my wife and I, and we sat for a long time. And eventually, these 3 people dropped off after 2 years, 3 years. They basically got fed up because the phenomena wasn't happening.
Yeah.
But 2 people came in to join us, and eventually they wanted to leave too, and they had been with us for over a year. And when I said why, they said, "It's you, Nick. We know you've been to school, we know you've had this wonderful experience, but you keep referring back to it when we get phenomena here in the circle. Oh yeah, I saw that tiny single little orb, but you should have seen the ones at school. Oh yeah, I thought I got it
kind of
touched."
downplaying it.
Yeah, always referencing something that we hadn't attained compared to school. And they said, "We want to try a different technique. Instead of putting the phenomena down, we want to get excited and happy that it's happening at all."
Do you think then it's feeding off the people in the room's energy, or the knowledge that it's real? I believe, therefore it is, kind of thing.
Yes, I'll tell you in just a moment, I think, what you need to have amongst the people that sit. But at that time, let's just say I was too judgmental. 6 months later, they were claiming fantastic phenomena, this couple, in their home circle. And I contacted them and said, "Can I join you?" Obviously, I've not got it right, but hey, I'm willing to learn. And the phenomena were just as spectacular. They had furniture rising in the air, spinning, going into a blur. It was disappearing through the ceiling. It was shooting past my head, going into the wall. Nothing was getting damaged. There was children running around, having sweets and playing with toys, and we could see them sometimes, but that was a pitch black seance. And then people would turn up and talk at length and give accurate clairvoyance. And as I say, I shook a man's hand and hugged a child on different occasions. But to go back to school, 6 months later, approximately, maybe 5 months later, in around January, February 1997, Robin Foy phoned me and said, "Nick, we would like you to come down for a sitting at school." And I said, he said, "You and your 4 Scottish friends, or your wife and 3 Scottish." And I said, "Well, that's very good to hear, Robin, but you told me it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." He said, "Yeah, I thought so too, but Spirit have specifically named, let's have the 5 people from Scotland back, because we want to try an experiment the likes of which we've never done before, and we need maximum energy." These people gave good energy in the last visit. So we went down, Very similar situation. We were excited. We knew what to expect. We'd had various, in 6 months, various sittings that were unsuccessful, but we still believed in what we had witnessed at school. And we went into the same cellar, which I checked beforehand. Nothing changed, and we got similar phenomena. We got lights, lots of them, but this time the lights were more like mini torch beams. It was directional light. You see, almost like a little hood round some of the orbs, and the light was more directed. So as the orb was crossing the room, it would point towards you, and you would be seen in the torch beam. I'm calling it torch beam, but it was still a circular, spherical light. It just seemed hooded, and there were more of them, and they were brighter. And then we were told, they were saying accurate clairvoyance. I can give you some examples of very accurate clairvoyance, and then we were told to pause, because beings from another dimension of existence were going to try and come through. And the spirit team said through the mediums, we don't know what to expect. What happened will intrigue you in particular, because it was unidentified aerial phenomena. It was UFOs. It was vehicles that materialized in the room and flew around. One was like a wedge of cheese or cake with a curved edge and a point at the other end, and it flew around. Another was like a big bulbous helicopter, and it was holding something underneath it in tiny little white kind of threads, and what it held underneath it was a bit like a fabric or a handkerchief. And as this helicopter with no blades, by just describing the shape of it, as it flew around the room, the lines underneath matched the trajectory and speed. And this white linen thing, or whatever it was, underneath would move and flow in the air as one would expect if it had been a helicopter carrying something. Another one was the classic flying saucer, the double saucer with the dome on top and little lights, but we couldn't see people. I'm guessing it would have been about 2 feet, maybe 2.5 feet in width. And there were 5 vehicles, in my memory, that I remember seeing. But
were you all silent? Were you all silent? Just like in awe of what you're looking at?
We weren't silent. We were absolutely ecstatic and talking to each other. And, did you see that? Oh my God, look, what's this? And so on. And it lasted quite a long time, like more than 20 minutes. But a tube appeared, a cylinder. And as it came towards me, I'm guessing it would have been 2.5 feet long, maybe, I don't think 3 feet. As it turned towards me, I could see into it. And it was like looking into a kaleidoscope. Lots of sharp-edged colours, white light, but as if it was looking through broken glass. And here's the thing. I knew the tube was roughly this size. And as you looked through it, it was like looking 7 feet. There was an impression of depth that you didn't get by looking at it side on. And then from that tube, and there was more than one tube appeared, but from a tube, a pair of hands emerged, just up to about beyond the wrist, the forearm. And they were miniaturized female hands. And as the tube pointed towards you, the hands came out and opened like this, and closed, and moved to the next sitter, and opened and closed.
And were they in the kind of prayer position as they closed?
Yeah. Now, do
you think there was significance to that, Nick, or never?
Well, definitely. Yeah. Hands are coming out of tubes with no body attached.
I know that's fabulous in itself, but are we looking at a spiritual connection to that with the...
I think I was just about to say there, it was either a little girl's hands or female hands that had been miniaturized.
Okay.
Because they were quite small, as small as a young girl. But the fingers and the fingernails just seemed that little bit more adult to me. So it could have been a miniaturized adult female. The the opening of the hands and the closing of the hands, I understand, and I can be corrected in this, that it's just a form of greeting if you're coming from another, say, the Far East or the Orient or something. It's a kind of blessing sort of thing, an acknowledgement of the other, rather than a blessing from a spiritual being. And a man materialized in front of my wife, shook hands with her. She was a little bit apprehensive because he was black. We could only see his silhouette. When the lights went around him, he blocked out the light as they passed from various perspectives. But I could see his silhouette very clearly. And he was speaking to my wife, and because of all the hubble and bubble and thing, I didn't hear exactly what he said. But she said to me, he said, "Don't be afraid, don't panic. I simply want you to know that we're here and we're real and we exist." Now that, with all of the phenomena and these craft materializing and then vanishing, I think that tells me what Robin Foy claimed. We've moved beyond deceased persons. We're now communicating with non-human intelligence or very advanced intelligence, which we presume not to be human. And they're able to manipulate matter in its purest form, which is light.
And do you think, Nick, that it took something like the sittings that you've done prior to that, and I would assume after, plus the skull experiment, to bring these things through? Or do you think that these things had the ability to appear when they wanted anyway?
The latter. You see, if I say it was all about me, Paul, then I'm going to come across as arrogant and untruthful, right? I think I contributed energy, and I contributed the ability to speak about it as I promised to do. I said to Spirit, if you can show me again unequivocal evidence of Spirit's existence, I'll tell anybody who's interested for the rest of my life, and I'll never charge a penny for it. And I've spoken in 3 or 4 countries about the school experiments, and I've never charged a fee. I've never even charged travel expenses. And that's because I was given a gift. And I was I'd like to think I wasn't a random choice. I was given it because I'd be able to use it and make progress with it in my own life and in telling others. And I think that's probably the main things I'd want to say about school. I recognize that people might not believe me because they've never had their own experience.
Well, you can't blame them in a way, but being a skeptical person yourself, but you know in your own heart. And I think what you've just said speaks volumes, Nick. You're not looking for any monetary gain when you've gone speaking about this. You've spoken overseas. So regardless of what anybody thinks, Nick, you can sit comfortable in your own truth. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. Just before you move on to the next little section, and before we move away from school, if that's what you want to do, you said your wife saw somebody materialize in front of her. Were you all having individual experiences, or could you see these experiences as well?
Some of them. There was so much going on with I suppose the 14 people in the room, 2 of them being mediums, but certainly for the 10 visitors, there was so much happening that there weren't many quiet spells, and everybody was having their own little experience, and sometimes talking about it afterwards. So if someone got touched, they would say, "I've just been touched on my left shoulder," and it felt like one of these little orbs, or it felt like a hand, or so on. Meanwhile, something's happening with me, it's caught my attention, and then I'll look over and see what's happening. So it was a little confusing because it was so busy.
Okay, thank you. There's something I want to ask you, because I've just seen my youngest daughter, Laura's in the room. I think Jessica were in as well earlier. I don't know if she still is. But we lived I still live in the same house. We've been here for like 34 years in this property. It's been very active. I mean, you may have or may not have heard of the Reverend Tom Willis. Tom Willis Tom Willis visited this house within 2 weeks of us moving in, because he lived about, I don't know, probably about, his church were about 500 yards away, and he didn't live too far away in Bridlington anyway. However, there were a lot of activity, and I don't expect you to have an answer, but I don't know enough about spirit or what this is. But we would walk into rooms in that house that's literally, because I'm in a different place at the moment doing this, about 50 yards away, and as you opened a door, a drop of light would just fall from the ceiling and disappear. As Laura would be a little girl, we'd all sit watching TV. It wouldn't have to be dark. Doesn't have to be dark. And we'd all just go, wow, did you see it? And a drop of light would just drop at the side, about the size of a teaspoon, and look like mercury, if that makes sense. And the shape of the end of a teaspoon. It just dropped from the ceiling and just gone. Every one of our girls used to see it. I saw it. Mary did. And it weren't just a one-off. It's happened for years and years. It kind of stopped when girls left home. Which is, any views on that? Have you experienced that before?
How old were your girls when it was happening?
Laura would be able to tell you. She's a bit youngish, so I suppose it happened from Sarah would be about 14, 15. Laura would be 7. Do you know, 4 girls? And it were happening. It were active, but things happened when they were little. When we first moved in the property, but you'd just open a door and you'd see it. Bosh! It had gone straight to the floor. Drop of light. The neighbours over the road. Literally, one of them still lives over the road, and her husband's passed away. Knocking on my door. Everything okay? Yeah, I've just been sat in the early hours in a leather chair. This guy, he'd worked in a foundry, and this is your talk, to be honest, Nick, but I'll just do this. This guy had worked in a foundry, damaged his lungs, and he couldn't sleep comfortably laying down. So he'd sit in a very comfortable chair in his front room, smoking cigarettes, believe it or not, his lung damage. But that was this guy. He said, and I'm watching world passing in early hours at morning. He says, I can see little orbs of light in the top rooms of the house. He says, and I'm thinking, kids have got a strange torch. He says, but it's early hours at morning. And then suddenly it drops, or they drop, and they're in next room. And I can see them through net curtains, and then they drop and they're in next room. And this guy had been over to our property a few times and seen this. So it had been active. But and just your views on it, Nick, and because you're more knowledgeable on this than me.
Can I visit your house this weekend?
You could come whenever you want, mate. Yeah,
because that sounds fascinating, and I would be fascinated if it happened in front of me, especially when I don't expect it. I think it's to do with energy, and I think it's to do with an energetic imprint in a particular property, because of who lives in the property and the fact that they have some connection with that energy. Now, this is a general point that probably lots of spiritualists or psychics would make, but I found it to be true in my own investigative experience. Things happen when there's a trigger and when there's particular people involved, and a strong, loving bond helps. Okay? You've got all of that.
Yeah.
You're living in the same house over time. You've got daughters. You're all a happy family, and you're sensitive to looking for, hoping, that kind of thing. The other thing is, and I don't want really to go into this, but hormonal changes in young people would be considered to be a factor. Trauma is considered to be a factor, including high levels of anxiety. And funnily enough, DIY is a factor in triggering phenomena.
Disturbances within the property.
Yeah, and sometimes spirits say to me, look what they've done with the place. You know, I'm not expecting to come into my own house and see bloody walls getting knocked down or whatever, you know. But Paul, I want to do something. I want to give my wife a shout.
Yeah.
And ask her to join me.
Please do.
Simply to speak for a couple of minutes, because I think your audience would like to hear from a witness apart from me, in case I'm a high-performing crazy.
Well, there's 168 people listening now.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Brilliant.
Well,
and thanks for support, guys.
Yeah. Just give me a few seconds.
Yeah. Very. How kind is that of Nick to step in last minute for us, Les? That's great, isn't it? Microphone, Les.
Absolutely brilliant. That's that, Paul, and we're going to thank him.
Yeah, he's back now, I think. Anyway, so he's got his headphones back on, Les. So you stay in row if you want, Les. Let's just. He's gone.
Okay. Paul.
Yes.
This is my darling wife. She's a feisty Irish woman. And if she doesn't agree with me, she will tell me.
You. Yeah, she'll tell you.
Yeah.
Hello.
And I regard her as a valid witness, because she will not say something unless she knows it to be true. And if she hears me say anything that's not true, she'd pull me up, even in public. Now, it doesn't happen very often, because it's usually just I remember things a little bit differently rather than I'm trying to deceive. But here's the thing. She doesn't expect to be speaking just now. I've asked her to come in, and so we haven't prepared a story, right? And she'll tell you if I'm talking rubbish, right? But I'm going to turn to her.
Nick, listen, you've literally stepped in last minute, so I know there's nothing prepared. So it's brilliant that your wife's offered to come and speak with us.
Okay,
thank you.
So, Sarah, I want you to tell the audience what happened to you during the school visits. Now, there were 2 visits, but you can telescope them together in terms of just brevity in describing. What are the sorts of things that impressed you at school?
Will people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was quite skeptical about school. I'd heard great things, very positive things. And I liked the fact that we were all searched beforehand. I felt that there was credibility there. And to cut it short, I was positioned by Robin Foy, pardon me, into a seat quite near him. In fact, what was between him and I was music. Everyone was positioned, and there was discussion about how we should behave, how we should react, or whatever. And initially, for the first few seconds, there wasn't very much. And then it was almost like a light show, little, what looked like orbs, except they were colored and there was a green tinge. And they grew and they moved around this room. Now, I'd met the other people sitting there at the time. And when we were initially in the cellar, you couldn't see them because it was pitch dark. And then they started to move and they got bigger and the room began to light up. So I could see people at the other side of the very large coffee table, their features virtually as clear as I'm seeing you now. There was various music. In my case, one of the mediums spoke and told through her, I think, was it, I can't remember, was it Blue that came through her and said about my phobia and about what had happened to me the night before. We'd stayed in a local inn, and I have a phobia about snakes. I get into the hallway of this local inn, and there in a caged glass container was a very, very large python. Pardon me. And I'd spent the night almost comatose in the bed going, that thing's going to get out and come underneath the door to me. Now, apart from Nick, no one else knew that.
Right.
And that was told to me about how uncomfortable I felt.
And can I interject just to say that I agree with that, but can you focus on physical phenomena
right
that happened to you?
Yes. then some voices appeared. I could hear some voices, as could everyone else. And they were saying to me, can you see us yet? All of that there. And the shapes and the forms of human beings emerged. And they were standing beside me. And one of them said to me about shaking his hand, because it was a male sounding voice. I shook his hand and he said, right, why don't you feel up my arm? And I got as far as the elbow and there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I did a very silly thing. I kind of screamed and, you know, what's going on? And they thought this was a joke. These two bodies were laughing. These two forms, these two shapes were laughing. I think I'd scared some of the other sitters as well. But Robin and the Assemble Company smiled because they knew what was going to happen.
How did it feel to the touch, Sarah? Was it cold or warm? Was it warm? Oh, he can't hear you, Nick. How did it feel? How did it feel to the touch? Was it cold or warm, Sarah? Excellent. You hear me now? There's no microphone on, no mic on, Nick. Nick could have just relayed that question. You can hear me, can you?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, excellent. How did the hand feel to the touch? Was it cold or warm?
Warm. It didn't feel rubbery. It felt like a normal human hand and arm.
Yeah.
And it was a male arm, but it wasn't warm. And, you know, afterwards I thought this would have been rubbery. It wasn't. It was just like I'd felt a normal human arm. But it was the fact when I got to the elbow, there was nothing. And that's a really quite unsettling situation.
Go on, sorry.
On you go. It's okay.
So how long did this excited atmosphere last for you guys? An hour?
Oh,
20
that
minutes?
was a couple of hours, all in.
Really?
A couple of hours. But throughout that, and I hadn't known at the time, the seat I was in was called the hot seat. And that was where things happened to people. We only discovered this later. But just after that, with these energy lights moving around and all of that, I was sitting beside a friend of ours, and suddenly my seat began to move. Now, there was a very short space, maybe 8 inches or whatever, 20 centimeters between the back of my chair and the wall, and the front legs of the seat I was in went up. I had no control at all. And it was as if somebody was holding it from the back, but because the energy lights were there, you could see there was no one behind me. Yeah. And the guy sitting next to me was able to lean over and put his hands underneath the chair legs and said, yep, she's up. She's up. The energy lights as well were, as I say, moving about, and they would rush up to people and stop. You could catch them in your hands and you could see them glowing. But at one point, one of the energy lights came across and was just moving about in front of my midriff. And suddenly it disappeared. And and this is going to sound crazy, but it basically went into my rib cage, and all I could feel was as if somebody was scratching me from inside. And then there was a pop, and it was out again and floating about. So these energy lights, I don't know if Nick said, they were round the legs of chairs, round the coffee table, up, down, etc. The second time we went to school, it was a very different feel in that we'd been invited back. They said that it was important we return with the energies and everything like that there. And they said they weren't very sure. And indeed, what we saw it surprised me. I don't know if Nick said about the hands. Yeah. You've said about the hands. But it was the shapes that emerged, Paul, that were probably the most stunning the most stunning aspect of the visit. The shapes had form.
Okay.
So almost like a cigar shape, a triangular shape, and a bit something that looked a bit, this is going to sound crazy, a wee helicopter.
Yeah.
But the lights underneath that particular shape seemed to work independently of each other. So they were like mini spotlights, and the spotlights moved around onto people. And again, the room was quite light, and you could see it, but it was dark enough that you could see these little beams, like little torches, onto people.
What do you think message was, Sarah? Was it so that you would go forward and share this information, or was it just the fact that Robin Foy and his group of people, inviting selected people, could just absorb what was happening? Do you think it? I'm just.
Well,
curious.
I think we did absorb it, but I know coming back, pardon me, it changed our lives.
Yeah,
because I started to talk to people and go, no, I'm not a high functioning crazy. I'm not this, I'm not that. This honestly happened. And I have to say, the whole way back in the car, pardon me, we couldn't stop talking. Did you see what I saw? Yes. Did you see this? Did you see that? I think it made me reflect on what was out there, about the fact that we don't really know, we don't really understand. And I think now it has created this lifelong interest of being with groups, talking about it. But at the same time, personally, it had a profound effect on me. I felt very special.
Yeah.
But also a little greedy, because seeing it once, I wanted to see it again.
So if you never saw anything again, or Nick, you know in your hearts you've had that. You've had that experience.
Well, yes, I mean, truly had that, and an amazing. And you feel, stop it, he's laughing at me. I feel very privileged, Paul, that I was given that opportunity, not once, but twice.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
He's wanting the headphones back.
Sarah, thank you. Thank you.
Paul, I didn't hear anything that you said to Sarah because it was coming through.
I realised that, mate. Yeah, I realised
that. So, and I don't want to be selfish. I'm quite happy to change the mic, but I don't think the quality will be the same.
I'll be honest with you, Nick. If you've got no objection, and it's an absolutely lovely to speak to Sarah, and please sit there all the time, Sarah. Because your input was absolutely amazing. I know she can't hear me, but I think we might jump to Les and get some questions for 10 minutes. And Nick, I've got one thing to ask you, and it might be asking too much, but we want you back on here for at least another hour, not tonight, another time, to share more of this, because there's more that people are going to want to hear. I want to hear more as well. Right, Les? Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for the show tonight, guys. It's been absolutely amazing. And I'm just going to bring, if I can get this one on the. You
can just say to Sarah that I'm saying thank you as well, because really appreciate
Tino, is just making a statement. I remember speaking to Nick on the Zoom meeting a couple of years back, and found him to be a very pleasant and knowledgeable fellow. I could listen to him for hours. Excellent guest choice indeed. And
thank you, Tino.
There we are.
Thanks, Tino.
Brilliant.
I'll pay you later.
Yeah. Right then, we'll just get a couple of normal questions. Rivington Pike Beast, Lee Roscoe, a question. What does Paul and Nick think of the mist which appears before something manifests?
Well, we've got 8 minutes, so I'll just briefly keep. I've seen a strange mist, and I likened it to Guinness being poured into a glass. Can you hear me, okay, Nick?
I can hear you. I'm just trying to think how can
I realise that.
Yeah.
It's swirling mist, and it felt a bit unnerving for me, to be honest. But I'll hand this over to Nick. It's Nick's night here to talk. What do you think, Nick?
When I think of all the things that have appeared to me, only some of them have been accompanied by a mist before, during, or after. Quite a lot of them simply appear.
Yeah.
So the mist, atmospheric conditions may be a sign of spirit trying to build up the energy, but it hasn't coalesced into orbs or anything yet. I haven't seen mist very often. Once, in a lady that I was helping, and I was bringing spirit in to do a healing, she held her hand up and there were wisps of mist or smoke coming from each of her fingers. And I hadn't seen that before. And I haven't really seen it since either. But so I'm sorry, I'm not much of a witness when it comes to mists.
No, it's good enough.
Because they don't have to accompany. The vast majority of what I see, 90% of what I experience doesn't have a mist.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I've got another question. Dragonborn, Nick, tonight is a full moon. Do you think this heightens these events?
Well, I don't want to be controversial if I can help it. The answer is I don't know, but I'm quite skeptical. There is a little bit of evidence that under a full moon, people's behavior changes. I know this from educational research. Children are a little bit more lively and so on. But I think there's a lot of nonsense spoken about the influence of planets and astrology. And all I would say to people who do believe in it is, where's the evidence? Because here's something that I think generally, not just about the moon, but generally, it's a load of words. What most people say is just a load of words. In other words, they're not as good as they think they are. And a lot of them don't know what they're talking about, but they'll never want to admit that. So they make it up to sound good. The truth is, I don't believe that the moon has very much effect on our choices, but yeah, it can lift the oceans of the world 20 feet in the air twice a day. So it's obviously powerful. But does that mean that, for example, if you're doing a ritual under moonlight, that it's going to add power to that ritual? I think it's more about who's in the ritual and what's the relationship between them than a distant planetary body.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll throw this one on. Steve-O71, how aware are you both of the original skull experiments and what are your thoughts on what it proved? I know you talked about this earlier on, Nick.
I think Nick's well aware of it, to be honest, Steve-O.
Yeah, well, I attended 2 sittings. I read the 300-page report and a book by Grant and Ruth Solomon that I was invited to contribute to, but I didn't know who they were at the time, so I declined. And I've read Robin Foy's book about witnessing the impossible. I've taken part in various discussions with the school researchers, and my view of school is a little bit different to some of the believers that are out there. But let's just be clear, nail my colours to the mast. It was awesome. It's an American overstatement. No, for this, the 2 school sittings that I had were awesome, wonderful, beyond doubt. Can I give you just one example?
Yeah, right? We've got 3 minutes, Nick. Yep. So
I occasionally used to drive in movies and so on and television, and I met a couple of special effects guys from Sony Pictures. And I said to them, can you replicate what happened in the school experiments? And I described the phenomena. And they said, no. Come on, guys, I'll give you £1 million each if you can dupe people with special effects in an underground cellar. I can, I don't have £1 million and anything like it. I was just wanting to see how far they would continue to say no before they said maybe. And they said, we don't think you're listening to what we're saying, Nick. You need 3 oil dampened platforms that are the size of a large armchair, and you need them to be oil dampened so that vibration from the road, which is outside, doesn't affect the picture. You need 3 constant lines of sight, and you describe the orbs as moving at high speed. Our images would blur at even a reasonable speed. You also talk about things happening going through tables and so on. None of what we can produce as a special effect would actually be physical going through anything. And you describe things happening round about your feet and so on. Think of the line of sight. It just wouldn't happen. The image would deteriorate markedly and couldn't be sustained for the hours that you took part in. It would be very, very limited. And we think that it's not a special effects thing that you've taken part in.
Not viable. Yeah, that's fabulous. And
we are out of time, guys, and definitely out of time. And I've got to thank Paul. I've got to thank Nick for coming on.
Nick and Sarah.
And Sarah, of course.
Yeah, thank you. And Alison, thank you very much, guys. Nick, stepping in at last minute.
Alison for doing the moderating. Thanks, Alison. I've got to thank the people who made a monetary donation to the channel tonight. That's TA. Love it big, says TA. And Rebecca King for the super sticker. Thank you, Rebecca. And on that note, we are out of here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.
We'll see you all. Yeah, we'll see you all on Sunday. So bye.
Okay.
Just hang fire a minute.